Will. Go.
Okay. Good afternoon, guys. Thanks for staying with us here. It's been a long day so far. So this talk's going to be a little bit of a change of pace, I feel like, from a lot of what we've seen today. A lot of what we've seen today is a lot of exploits, a lot of cutting-edge research. This problem that we're going to talk about today is based on a few things. Number one, the law of large numbers, the ability of attackers to get off a lot of requests with these tools that they use. And number two, the prevalence of stolen credentials out there on the black market, and the fact that we humans are humans and love to reuse passwords across all of our different accounts. Big problem. So my name is Will Glazier, and this is I'm here on behalf of my colleague Mayank Dimon as well. He was unable to make it. We work for a company called Stealth Security. We're based out of the San Francisco Bay Area in California. And what our company has built is a tool that's expressly designed to solve this problem at enterprises large and small. And I'll take you through a little bit of, I'll take you through the tools that we see attackers use. This presentation is going to be in two parts. We're going to go over the attacker's perspective. What are their requirements to launch these attacks? What do they do? What's their game plan? And then as defenders, especially network admins, what can you do today? You know, you don't have maybe the time or the money to go purchase a really expensive tool, but there's a lot of open source capabilities you can leverage, a lot of low-hanging fruit in detection, a lot of things that stick out like a sore thumb that you can use to detect these attacks. So what do I mean by an automated attack at scale? What is that? Well, it's fundamentally a bot problem. And what this circle here is meant to represent is attack traffic that makes it through all your perimeter defenses on your site, your firewall, your WAF, all that stuff. And what we see in that traffic is that actually a significant percent of it is automated attacks. Also aggregators, scrapers, those of you who use products like Mint. I don't know how popular that is around here, but like places that'll aggregate all your financial data so that you can see it in one place, any of your rewards points. We see a lot of that, and that's behavior and traffic on sites that sometimes network admins don't want, and they finds it takes up resources, takes up bandwidth. And what's important here with deciphering this traffic, just separating the good from the bad, is determining intent of each request. And the intent of these attackers are use cases like some of the following. Account takeover is the obvious one, when people reuse passwords. If they can crack those passwords, crack open accounts. There's also fake account creation to do things like launder money, post a bunch of spam on forums, get eyeballs and get traffic to a certain site. Steal your personal information, data from a site, scrape it. Things like shopping bots, where you're going to a site that sells tickets for a concert or for a sporting event, and as soon as those tickets become available for sale, you write a program that buys them all up, and you resell them for even higher value. So first, let's talk about the attacker's perspective. What do they need to accomplish these goals? I've got listed up here the 5 pillars of a credential exploitation attack. This is what's in the paper. But I think you can even narrow these down to 3, a trifecta. I call them the holy trinity of the credential exploitation attacks. I'm getting all the religious references here out of the way. So those 3 are tools, infrastructure, and credentials. And I'm going to start with tools first. We're going to go over some black market attack tools, custom scripts also, that are configured for certain targets, and this is the first big must-have for the attackers. Now, I'm not sure how familiar many of you might be with tools such as Sentry MBA is the first one here. That is the most popular cracking tool on the underground market. These tools are also called account cracking tools in many places. We tend not to use that term. I don't really know why, but this is a screenshot of Sentry MBA. It's actually just it's a neatly written program. You download the binary. It's got a GUI and everything. Makes it extremely easy for script kiddies and novice attackers, folks who don't need to even know how to write a line of code, to launch these attacks. And what these tools require often are configuration files. And what a configuration file is simply a text file that tells the tool what is the login flow, the request response pattern, the auth expressions for a certain site. What does a valid login response look like? What does a invalid login response look like? And some config files include what's called a capture setting, where that enables the attacker to actually log in and check the balance of whatever account you're logging in, maybe a bank, maybe an award wallet, check the balance and the information in it without logging back in again, which is good because it means that that's less volume from their tool, more of a chance that they'll fly under the radar. And these config files are actually one of the chief ways to monetize in this ecosystem. And when we talk about monetizing, we did a threat report on the most popular underground forum for this tool, and we found some interesting observations. First of which is that there's a lot of targets, over 1,800 on just this one site. 10% of the Alexa top 1,000 have config files that are readily available, and they are not expensive. Only $1.73 was the average cost of a config file. And it's not just your web traffic either. It's 10% of config files here are configured for APIs. They could be like a legacy API, a mobile login API, et cetera, et cetera. Here's a screenshot from our report of popular target sites. You guys probably recognize most all of these. Netflix, Instagram. Just think of what would like a 15-year-old boy want to crack into on accounts, and you probably get your answers. Target industries, same pattern. Gaming, entertainment, e-commerce, another one. And what we see here also listed are the average cost of config files in each of those industries. And what the cost represents is a little bit of how valuable is the underlying data in that account. So obviously healthcare, $5 relative to only $1.50 for entertainment. Banking should be on here somewhere. Finance, $5, a little bit more expensive as well. So those are the tools, Sentry, MBA, the others were listed there. There's also, obviously, attackers can just write like shell scripts, bash scripts, write a Python script using the request library, whatever you want. It's pretty easy to do. So the second part of our holy trinity here is sets of stolen credentials. The attackers need to have the credentials to rotate through to try to see what credentials are being reused by humans that they can break into. And this is just a screenshot of the Have I Been Pwned API, which many of you are probably familiar with. You can look up whatever username you want, and it'll show you if it's been compromised in any of the popular breaches on the underground. But some statistics I want to draw your attention to are here. You can write a simple pastebin crawler yourself that either crawls Twitter or crawls pastebin itself to get more than 20,000 credentials a day. And users average 6.5 credentials per 50 websites. This is according to Microsoft research team. So the problem isn't going to go away because humans will always reuse passwords or use a very similar one. A quick aside on how much certain accounts are worth. You can read this information here and see that, see the obvious conclusions that banking credentials and health insurance credentials are more expensive. And one thing I wanted to sort of draw your attention to is this down here at the bottom, just to keep in mind for later when we get in the presentation. If an attacker can get off 1 million requests and try 1 million credentials, and they succeed at a paltry rate of 0.1%, and each account is selling for 25 cents, which is a bit cheaper than what you see here, they could net $250. Just keep $250 in your mind as a break-even point. And now we're going to talk about infrastructure. So we've gone through tools, credentials, and now it's on to infrastructure. And the reason I talk about these three things in tandem is because as an attacker, when you're testing out if these tools work, oftentimes you won't change, like many other things when you're testing, you want to just change one variable at a time. You'll change the tool if it's not working. You'll change the credentials if they're not working, or you'll change the infrastructure. Not often do we see them change many things at once. But let's go over what are the different options for attackers that we've seen in the wild for them procuring this infrastructure to launch these attacks. And the first one is cloud hosting providers. We've actually seen, that attackers love these services because they're cheap. They provide massive computing power at scale, and especially high reputation ones like Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud. No network admin, no company is ever going to blacklist an org like that. It's just never going to happen. So you can hide, hide in plain sight. And obviously the fact that these are all VPS servers allows you the ability to create these programmatically. And this graph, I apologize if it's a little small and a little blurry, but the three huge bars that stick out here, I know OVH and I know Linode are very popular here, and they're very popular amongst bad guys also as a cloud hosting provider service. This is a snapshot from like 1 week's traffic at a United States retailer in September, and you see that the volume from some of these cloud hosting providers is massive compared to other ones like Amazon a little smaller, Google a little smaller. What we see here, this chart is the IP distribution, so not the volume of traffic, but the number of different IPs that were rotated through. And the same pattern bears itself out. Linode here is the top one. DigitalOcean and Amazon and OVH are also prominent. And these percentages here that are graphed, there's basically the percent of malicious traffic that we saw from these providers, and it's shockingly high. I mean, from the OVHs of the world and Linode and DigitalOcean, we saw 95, 99% malicious traffic. Because if you think about it from a business case, what kind of normal user is going through VPS servers like that to just log into their Amazon account? It's very infrequent. And a lot of times, the legitimate traffic we see from those orgs is actually the aggregators. Like if I have created a new aggregator or have created a new tool, maybe I'm a startup company who's just created the newest like rewards points aggregator, I'll probably run my infrastructure on Amazon. And in that case, that's legitimate stuff, but maybe the network admin wants to have control over it. And the reason why they love these cloud providers is because they can rotate through many IPs very fast. And you might think from a defender's perspective, how long do these IPs stick around? How fast are they recycled? Do we never see the same IP again twice? And the answer, because this seems like a limitation of trying to even consider thinking about using IPs. And the answer is that they're actually around surprisingly long. We saw, we have our own internal threat intelligence databases and crawl like open source feeds and stuff. And we saw that in these attacks from these cloud providers, over 80%, like over 90% of the IP addresses appeared in at least one threat feed. Like 80% appeared in more than 5. And also that same 80% showed up like more than 1 week or 1 month before these attacks. So the IPs are surprisingly sticky, and you can gain more value than you might think by using those kind of blacklists. Here's an example of traffic from Amazon. You can see here we've got, I apologize again for the blurriness of this picture, but rotating through 500 IPs with 364 different user agent strings. We see the presence of leaked credentials here. This is a snapshot of a screen from our tool, but with the blurriness, it makes it a little hard to decipher everything. Option 2, so after cloud hosting providers, another thing we saw is a botnet of compromised IoT devices. And we saw this, at this data we observed in December of last year and December and January, at a large financial institution in the United States. And what happened was we saw a lot of, garden variety account takeover traffic hitting this customer's site. And we decided to go through those IP addresses and port scan them, map them out, see what they were, and then try something as simple as just connecting to them on an HTTP port, like port 80 or port 8080 or 443. And we found that there were tons of different kinds of open home routers, DVR camera systems, different web servers, 4 webcams, even one like industrial control system. I don't know where the heck that was, but many of these routers and device types had, easily Googleable exploits or Googleable default credentials. And many people obviously don't reset the default credentials on their router, and many of these were old. So just this combination of circumstances allowed these attackers to build up these sort of botnets that they could just rent out. And here's an example of one. We just went to port 8080 on one of the IP addresses, and it was wide open, the admin page. You could go through the SSH logs and actually see that other attackers were trying to brute force log into this device to try to take it over. It was a bit of a tug of war between the two attackers. They wanted to commandeer it for themselves to resell to others. Other device examples, here's some webcams from Brazil, D-Link and Huawei routers. This MikroTik router OS had like an RCE vulnerability that we Googled for this firmware that was pretty easy to find. So that's, but everyone probably knows about those things. The third option was something that we saw that maybe we didn't expect when we started researching this problem. And we've called it an artificially geo-distributed proxy farm, or the AWS for bad guys. And this guy here, the reason I have a picture of Levi Strauss, other than to shamelessly plug my home state, is that, in the California gold rush of the mid-1800s, the guys that struck it rich were not the actual miners of the gold themselves. So in this case, it's not the script kiddies and the attackers that are actually getting rich off this. They're causing a lot of heartburn for network admins and for fraud analysts and for the people whose livelihoods are on the defensive side of this, but they're not getting rich off this. The guys who are actually making the money are the ones selling the infrastructure to these criminals. And that was what Levi did. He created Levi's jeans back in the gold rush, sold jeans to the gold miners, and he made a killing and started one of the biggest businesses in the world as far as clothing goes. So who is this actor and what were we seeing from them? Well, we were seeing, here's a list of some of the ISPs and orgs and ASNs, some of the indicators that we saw. And here's a representative who is Query that, many of the networks look just like this with a few different names. And this screenshot is the one I want to highlight here. They basically would take these large /21 and /22 subnets, and they'd break them down even further into a bunch of /25 subnets. And all they were doing was changing the registration information on the whois record. But what that was doing was fooling commonly used third-party geo IP location providers like MaxMind. And so what MaxMind would, in the same subnet, we had the Cape Town network, Seoul, Cairo, Jakarta, Las Vegas, Hanoi, Tehran. So according to MaxMind, which is what a lot of these businesses and defenders will use to get an idea from a business perspective of where this customer might be coming from, the data was totally incorrect, because you look at this and first you think, this is very suspicious. How could this all be? How could traffic that's just in a the 0/25 versus the 128/25 subnet be coming from all the way across the world? So we looked into that. This stuff is just some more indicators. This was the email address used in the registration information, and we saw a username with the same pseudonym, marketing these proxies on some forums that we, that traffic the same tools that we were looking at. And why don't maybe I'll get to it later, sorry. So the case study of this, this artificially geo-distributed proxy farm was at a large US retailer. And what we saw is greater than 2% of their login traffic for a period of more than 4 months was coming from these networks. They used at least 6 different attack tools, Sentry MBA being one of them. 40,000 IP addresses from 61 different countries. Nearly 75% of it, according to MaxMind, blending in with United States customers, that's smart of the attackers. They want to blend in with where these guys are coming from. Thousands of accounts compromised every week. So, in reality, was this traffic really all coming from the United States? And the answer to that after we did some research, the answer to that is no. There were certain ASNs in that list I showed you there that were entirely either coming from, mostly it was just either the United States and Russia. There were 2 providers, 3 large ASNs in particular, that 2 of them entirely coming from Russia, 1 of them coming from the United States. This is an example of, we did a big distributed traceroute experiment. We pinged, we tracerouted these IPs from 4 different locations around the globe. And this is an example of some of the subnets. He had a subnet for Baltimore, Dallas, Detroit, Honolulu. If you're familiar with the geography of United States cities, these are thousands of miles apart. And to, you know, the median round trip time from Moscow was 3 milliseconds every time, whereas from Washington it was 135. And the reverse is, or the same pattern is true for subnets that said they were from Brazil, Belarus, Canada, China, all over the globe. And when you look at the actual, you know, according to, you just go Google, like, what are actual ping times between locations, Wonder Network, you know, what is the actual ping time between Washington and Moscow? 136, suspiciously close to what we just saw. So the country labels, according to MMDB, for this USA traffic were not entirely correct. Of that 75% here that was supposedly from the United States, this is the distribution of where the traffic was actually coming from. The majority, like I said, the majority of the United States and Russia, those were three of those big ASNs that were launching this traffic. So how do these guys monetize? How is this Levi Strauss-like character cashing in on this? Well, he simply just sells these as, you know, oh, buy my proxies for rent on, you know, on whatever website he's got today. So this is one of the websites here, and the reason I told you to keep that like $250 mark in mind, that break-even point, is because look how much this guy is selling, you know, 30 days of access to these proxies, and this is like his premium proxy package for $250. You know, he talks about here, this site, this was the one we pinpointed as the one that was hosting all this crap. And it was, you know, he said, oh, we have our data centers in Kaluga, Russia. We, you know, support SOX proxies. We've got servers all over the world. Everything that we were seeing was sort of corroborated here, hosted by this depot data center. And so $250, if the attacker can launch more than 1 million requests in a day and get a 0.1% success rate and sell the accounts for 25 cents, they've already made $250 and they've already broken even after 1 day. So it's really all about the economics for these guys. And as long as they can get off enough requests, then the economics are good. So the defender's challenge is, how do we detect these attacks proactively instead of reactively, instead of using blacklists and instead of analyzing the traffic after the fact or blocking these accounts once they get compromised? So that takes us to the defender's perspective. And I've written out, again, 5 pillars, 5 tools for detecting these automated attacks at scale, detecting these tools in a proactive way. And the first one that we've focused on has been analysis of the HTTP requests and their headers to fingerprint these attack tools. Look at what these tools behave like on your network, on any given network, but everybody's network will be different, obviously, based on things like where you terminate your SSL connection or what CDN provider you're using. But what we've done, you know, we have a case study here on Sentry MBA for fingerprinting these requests. There's obviously a set of default user agent strings that are used in Sentry MBA, and you know, that's great to know the defaults. You should be aware of some obvious triggers or obvious alerts that this attack tool is coming, because these are very uncommon user agent strings that are not used that much in the wild. One of them even is actually the testing user agent string for this tool. So when you're trying to configure it, the requests come in with just this user agent string, and many times we've seen the attackers not even know how to use the tool correctly. They launch a ton of attack traffic with this user agent string, so another dead giveaway. But as far as fingerprinting the HTTP requests, what we did is we went through and parsed, you know, 1,500 of these config files and found that only 12% actually changed the request fingerprint, as far as like which headers were present, which weren't, how they came in across the wire. Only 12% changed that fingerprint, often missing things like refer, accept language, accept encoding. So you can gain, once again, a lot of value from looking at the default behaviors and knowing how things behave in your environment, and then using those indicators to act on proactively. Traffic patterns for this tool we saw at, once again, I believe this is at another large retailer. We saw both high velocity and low and slow attacks. As you see here, the red traffic is Sentry, the green is just all traffic throughout the day. Periods of low and slow attacks, periods of high velocity, some spikes. And we saw both some attacks where they were succeeding with 0.1%, 0% successful login rate. That was their recon activity, and then once they'd figure out which credentials would work, they would come back and log in with success ratios greater than 90, 95%. And the second pillar of detection kind of goes hand in hand with the first as far as fingerprinting these requests. And that is, we've developed some machine learned models to detect what we call forged browser behavior. And what that really is understanding what certain browsers look like in your environment and then just finding deviations from that norm when they're saying, according to the user agent string, that they are a certain browser. If I see tools with the same exact traffic with the exact same request fingerprint and rotating through user agent strings like Chrome 61, Firefox 55, Safari 10, that should raise a big red flag in your mind because those three browser families don't behave very similarly. And what we see here is, two attack tools that we called internally Vlad and Drago, because we like to watch Rocky movies, I guess, was that, this first one was impersonating Firefox 40 on Windows 10, but behaved very similar to a command line tool like wget or curl, which is obviously a suspicious behavior. No normal user would be behaving like that. And then this other tool, Drago here, was impersonating Chrome 56 on Windows 8, and didn't behave like any other browser in the Chromium family, like not Chrome, not Android, not anything like that. So these, the traffic patterns from these tools, you can see how many different ISPs and orgs and countries they come from. No single ISP and org was responsible for more than 3.5% of the traffic. So even if you were to try and create some kind of infrastructure-based blacklist for these tools, it would you'd have to maintain it like crazy, and there'd be no one org that could get you a ton of value. This graph here is just I think it's that same graph I showed you earlier, just with all three tools overlaid on it. And you can see that these attack tools were responsible for every large spike in traffic at this environment, meaning that they're massively over-provisioning the servers to account for those large spikes. And one of the attack tools, another low-hanging fruit that we saw, every request said that it came from the United States, but the accept language header was RU every single time, which again was kind of weird. So here's the third pillar of detection that we've talked about, and it's, I've sort of ragged on using IP blacklist or using org-based, infrastructure-based blacklist, but they do serve a purpose and they serve a role in stopping these, which, and they don't just include infrastructure either. They include credentials. So finding these leaked credentials and gathering them, collecting them for defensive purposes can get you a lot of value as well. And so here's some observations from traffic from all of those attack tools versus legitimate traffic. And with the attack tool Sentry MBA, we saw 23% of the credentials tried were available in the MySpace breach, 19% in the Adobe breach, and 17% in LinkedIn. And importantly here, each username tried appeared in an average of 3.5 breaches. The other attack tool, that one that was impersonating Firefox 40, appeared in very similar, actually even higher ratios of those credentials were pretty bad. Now, we compared that to legitimate traffic, and this is where some differences stood out. 42% of credentials in legitimate traffic didn't appear in any credential breaches that we could find. And significantly, each username appeared in an average of only 2.6 breaches. So if you have that data on these leaked credentials, that can help, again, give you some insight into not just how suspect is a particular account, but how suspect is a batch of requests rotating through a batch of credentials based on what the distribution of stolen credentials looks like. And once again, I think I've kind of focused on a few attack tools that are primarily designed to attack your web interfaces, but these tools are not limited to the web interfaces, and we see the attackers move to whatever channel there's the least resistance on. That could be your mobile app, or that could be like a legacy API that you don't even know exists. We've had that happen where, you know, or a new app API that just came out that your development team just created, but you have no idea that it exists yet. So here's an example of a tool that was hitting a legacy API of another retailer. That this picture here, again, I apologize for it being so blurry, but it was responsible for 97% of traffic to a legacy API login. So honestly, this provider was better off if they had just shut down this thing than keeping it alive. It was costing them more to maintain than it was worth. This CoolPad device here is like a very popular Chinese mobile device, which should raise a red flag for a retailer that does no business in China. So that, you know, that alone is enough in this case. But you can also use those other techniques that we talked about to fingerprint these tools and, you know, decide whether or not they're malicious or legitimate. Here's another attack tool. This one was just responsible for a massive volume of their web login traffic. This isn't, you know, I don't know why I have this in the API section, but the traffic came from, you know, over 210 different countries with the same accept language value, no matter where it came from, which is obviously suspect when you look at that traffic as a whole. And here's another large, you know, data analytics pattern that those of you who have the capability to look at that in your environment can look at, and that's this pattern of averaging exactly one login request per unique username for a sustained period of time. Now, when you think about this, it seems quite obvious, and maybe even like too obvious, but think about it. If legitimate traffic was to have a ratio of one login request per username, that means that everyone in this room would go to whatever site we're trying to go to our bank, you know, and check our balance after payday. And that means all of us logged in successfully the first time right away. No typos, no nothing. And then for those of us that did make a typo or forgot our password, we just gave up and went away. That's very unlikely to happen. If folks hit the login page, usually they want to go there for something, so they'll try again. We saw that legitimate traffic has a ratio much along the lines of 1.15 to 1.3 login requests per unique username. So that would be, you know, closer to, for, you know, 1 out of every 3 people, there'd be 1 out of every 4 people, there would be someone who would either forget their password and try again, or just forget their password, try again, and successfully log in. So I have some conclusions and takeaways. They should be pretty apparent from what we talked about. But these easy-to-use attack tools have, you know, lowered the barriers to entry. You saw Sentry MBA. You saw that tool has a GUI there. There's things as simple as using curl and wget in big scripts that you've written, or just modifying those libraries slightly to make changes and to try to get through whatever defenses are deployed. We see that sensitive data breaches are always going to continue. And from a defender's perspective, pursuing this data for preventative measures is a good idea. And you can gather intelligence based on traffic, based on certain batches of traffic that are hitting your site, and how compromised those credentials are. Now, also, an important conclusion is from that first part of our attack is about attackers' infrastructure. They have a variety of ways to gather the infrastructure they need. They've got those cloud hosting providers. They've got those IoT botnets, compromised machines. They've got the AWS for bad guys. So you need to continually be staying up to speed on what and researching what kind of infrastructure that these guys are using. And, you know, most importantly, I would say, is that researching and fingerprinting the network characteristics of these tools is an extremely effective first step. You can, you know, run these tools in a test environment, or run normal browser traffic in a test environment through Wireshark, through an open source IDS, and see how they behave in your environment, and then go ahead and stamp that as, that's my legitimate Chrome fingerprint. And then when you look at that legitimate Chrome fingerprint, you should see that the user agent distribution should roughly match the version distribution in the wild, you know, like Probably the most common version is the latest stable one. I think it's like 61. And then you'll see a little bit of 62 because that's the latest development version, and then some older ones mixed in there. But it shouldn't be evenly distributed. That would be very suspicious. If you see something evenly distributed across dozens of different versions, that's pretty suspect. But you'll only know that if you can go ahead and fingerprint the network characteristics first. And then final conclusion is that attackers will migrate to whatever channel has the least friction, and APIs are vulnerable, and network admins obviously need visibility there as well. So with that, a big thank you from Mayank and myself. It's been a pleasure to be here. And any questions, feel free.
Thank you very much, Will. Very comprehensive overview. We do have time for a few questions, so are there any questions in the audience? Please wave, because my eyesight is very poor.
I put everybody to sleep, I guess.
You're not having any cookies if you're not asking questions. I'm coming with the microphone. He really wants cookies.
Thanks. Thanks for the talk. Are you aware of any existing, free or cheap solutions to implement this kind of detection on the server? Yeah. Some kind of IDS?
Yeah. So I'm trying to think. I mean, what a lot of folks will try to do if they're looking for open source tools will be to go for, use a mod security WAF, open source, and then try to modify that WAF to do this. But we found that that's maybe not as, that's not going to do as well with looking at these group transaction level details as a whole and fingerprinting these things. You could use like a Bro IDS or IPS to and try to create your own, and use if you use the Elk stack, you could probably jerry rig a homegrown solution with Elasticsearch to get this data as it's streaming in and create these patterns. Those are some good open source tools if you're on a tight budget. There's also, I mean, I'm not going to stand up here and sell our product because that's not the point of this thing. But there are folks in the commercial sphere that are working on this as well. And it's probably not as expensive as you might think if you're part of an organization that has some kind of budget. But yeah, those are the Elk stack and Bro, I say, would be a good place to start.
And as a user, the best way to protect from this is maybe two-factor authentication? Or?
Yeah, as a user, obviously 2FA, and just don't reuse passwords. That's the biggest thing. Don't reuse passwords. We're all guilty of it. I stand up here and talk about it, and then I still catch myself doing it. So, not good. But
thanks.
Another question?
Hello. You use a lot user agents in order to detect bad traffic. You use a lot user agents of browser. Are there other things that you use?
Yeah, so, obviously I stood up here and talked about how these guys are going to rotate through tons of user agent strings, so it might not be a good indicator. But once again, I think it's important to highlight sometimes the triviality of these attacks, how easy they are to detect if you use something like user agent strings, and you just see that there are some particularly weird and particularly bad user agent strings. It really depends on the sophistication of the attacker. Obviously a sophisticated attacker will rotate through perfectly legitimate normal Chrome, normal Firefox user agent strings, so it's absolutely useless in that case. But there are some like that, CoolPad tool I showed at the end there that was a Chinese mobile device, hitting a US retailer. So you can use them for sure. Given your business case, given what you know about your environment, you can absolutely use them. But it all just depends on the sophistication of the attacker.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions yet? Or Okay, so thank you again, Will, and we're gonna wrap up.